Hey guys, welcome back to Econ Time with SK. So grab your notebooks, your favorite cup of coffee, and let's get started. Basically, the main question we're asking here is which market structure is better for society? Perfect competition or monopoly? To determine this, we will compare total welfare for the perfectly competitive market to the monopoly case. So let's actually try and understand what's happening on this slide that we've got here. First, if we're dealing with a monopoly market, right? And remember, the market is the firm in the case of the monopoly. Okay, what quantity will be produced? It's going to be QM. Why? Because that is where MC equals to MR. So let's see, for the monopolist, this is the green curve. This is my marginal revenue. Marginal cost is this upward sloping curve. So basically, this is where MC equals to MR for the monopolist. So you see, this is the quantity produced by the monopolist. And of course, as we trace up and hit the demand curve, this gives us the monopolist price. So now let's discuss the perfectly competitive market. Notice I am talking about the market, not each firm. In the perfectly competitive market, what do we know? In the market, we know demand curve is downward sloping, supply curve is outward sloping, right? So let's just see if we can find that here. Well, we've got the demand curve here, downward sloping demand curve. Where is the supply curve? Remember, we just discussed it a while ago. For the perfectly competitive market, the MC curve is the supply curve for the perfectly competitive market. Now, if we are talking about the perfectly competitive market, well, where does it reach its equilibrium? Where demand intersects supply. So that's going to be where D equals to S. And so here, the quantity produced will be QC by perfect competition. And the price, of course, is at the intersection of demand and supply. So this is going to be PC. So this is price in perfectly competitive market. Notice a few things off the bat, okay? Things that are quite obvious to us. Firstly, what do you notice about the price? Where is the price higher? Well, the monopolist charges a higher price. So in terms of price, we're saying monopolist price is higher than price under perfect competition. Okay. And what do we notice about the quantity produced? All right. Well, we see that the quantity produced under monopoly is less than the quantity produced under perfect competition. So both in terms of price and quantity, it seems like perfect competition is better. But we cannot come to that conclusion by only looking at the price and quantity produced under the two different market structure. Instead, what we are going to do is compare the social welfare under monopoly versus under a perfectly competitive market. So how do we do that? Okay, again, let's just refresh our memory. Remember, we dealt with producer surplus and consumer surplus. So usually if you've got a demand curve, you've got a supply curve, right? This is the equilibrium price. This is the equilibrium quantity. What is the idea? The idea is this: all points below the demand curve but above the equilibrium price, that actually is your consumer surplus, okay? And then let's get an interesting color. And then from the producer's point of view, the area above the supply curve but below that equilibrium price, this is your producer surplus. So now, after that refresher, can we go and find the same thing here? Yes, we can. So the first thing we see is that when we're dealing with perfect competition, basically it's very straightforward. All points below the demand curve but above the equilibrium price, everything here is your consumer surplus under perfect competition. What I'm saying is that under perfect competition, consumer surplus are which areas? A plus B plus C. And under perfect competition, producer surplus is going to be all points above the supply curve but below the equilibrium price. So D plus E, right? Producer surplus is going to be D plus E. So what will be total welfare? Total welfare is going to be consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which is equals to A plus B plus C plus D plus E. Okay? So this is the total welfare when we are dealing with perfect competition. So perfect competition's total welfare. All right, now let's figure this out for the monopolist. For the monopolist, our focus is going to be this price and this quantity. This is going to be our focus. So the monopolist is charging this price, which means to figure out consumer surplus is just the area under the demand curve and above the monopolist price, right? So this is actually the consumer surplus for the monopolist. Let me just write that down. Monopoly consumer surplus is A. So B plus C is gone, right? Before there was B plus C, that's no longer here. Where did B go? Where did C go? Let's see. Now the producer surplus is above the area, above the supply curve, but below whatever price is being charged in the market. So it's going to be this whole trapezium. So actually it's going to be B plus D. Well, part of our question got answered. Where did B go? This B here was just transferred to the producer surplus, right? So now we've also, of course, got a deadweight loss, right? Deadweight loss is something that completely disappears. No one in society gets it. Consumer doesn't get it, producer doesn't get it, nobody does. So the deadweight loss here actually is, well, this is the output that is no longer being produced. Look here. The output that is no longer being produced is QM and QC amount, right? Because that's what I initially said. The monopolist actually produces less than the perfectly competitive market. So let's just say, if this was like 50, this was 100, what we're saying is that, hey, you know what? These 50 units are no longer being produced. If this 50 unit is no longer being produced, so what we're saying is that, hey, this part here, C plus E, well, this is no longer going to be going to anybody. It's not going to the producer. It's not going to the consumer. So this is completely lost to society because that output, QM to QC, that 50 units is no longer being produced. So the deadweight loss is going to be C plus E. So now, what is the monopolist total welfare? Well, the monopolist total welfare is, remember, it's going to be just consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which is going to be A plus B plus D. All right. So now let's just compare these two. The perfect competition's total welfare was A plus B plus C plus D plus E. But when it comes to the monopolist, the total welfare is A plus B plus D. So what do we see? We see the total welfare has gone down, right? And where has it gone? Well, it's basically C plus E has now completely disappeared. This is what we are calling the deadweight loss. So what we're saying, the conclusion is what? For the monopolist, total welfare is less than the perfect competition market's total welfare. Because since the monopolist produces a lower output than perfect competition, areas C plus C plus E completely disappear. That is, there's a deadweight loss. Okay. So once again, these are concepts you've seen before, but they're still very important. Deadweight loss is when it completely disappears. But what do we call B? Well, B was previously with the consumer, now it's with the producer. This is called a transfer. Why is it called a transfer? Because transferred from consumer surplus under perfect competition to producer surplus under monopoly. All right. So because this doesn't completely disappear, this is still there, but it's just changing hands. That's why this is not part of deadweight loss. Okay. So what you've seen here is the fact that we can actually conclude that perfect competition is better for society than a monopoly, because when there's a monopoly, if a perfectly competitive market shifts to being a monopoly, well, you know what? There's going to be deadweight loss. All right, guys, I shall see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.